the website anyway. My name is Rick Stabbard. For those that don't know me, I co-chair the Government Affairs and Economic Development Committee, along with Glenn Morris. Today we have Aaron Clausen with us, the city planner, to talk about the parking study. And this kind of joins in with our speaker last month, Jessica Chapini from the parking department, to talk about some of the new initiatives going on in that department, modernizing that department, and some of the enforcement issues that they're dealing with, as well as trying to, keep up and be uniform in the way that they carry out their duties. So we all know parking is a challenge in the city, and a lot of development and brings a lot more folks into the city, and a lot of times that's without parking, and that's the zoning right. So Aaron's been conducting this parking study. It's going to, probably impact a lot of the businesses, especially those in this general area. So I'm glad we have Aaron with us today to talk about it. So thanks for coming out.
Thank you, Rick. Appreciate it. Thank you all for having me here this morning. I think many of you may have been at one of our earlier public meetings, but as Rick pointed out, the city, through the parking department, had funded this parking study to identify, well, first, inventory and understand the existing conditions. What's the parking dynamic in the downtown more generally, and then out of that, develop some strategies to better provide for parking across the system. I just want to make sure. I think Rick, you wanted this to be recorded. So do we know if this is being recorded, or?
I think when
before I
Ryan started, I heard it say recording in process.
Okay, good. I just don't want to go too far. Cool. Just to backtrack slightly here. Well, first of all, I've met, I think, all of you. I'm Aaron Clausen, the principal planner for the city of Lynn, and so help a lot of different departments, the city, the community, envision a future for the city. Recently, we completed the comprehensive plan called Vision Lynn, the first ever comprehensive plan that the city has done through a lot of engagement through the community to help create that vision for the future and lay out a general strategy for how to achieve that. So in that plan, what we heard, not a surprise to any of you being business owners and institutions in our downtown, that there's a need to come up with a better solution for parking so that people can access our downtown more easily and have easy access to parking. So this parking study comes right out of this plan as one of the primary implementation strategies that came out of that. The idea with the comp plan too, just before I jump into the parking study, is that there are three different sort of districts or regions in the city. There is the sort of what we call transformed district. These are areas across the city that there's an identified opportunity for growth and investment, but in that formulation, there's an intentional strategy to transform that area into something different. Like the strategies, the investments are trying to change that place from what it is now to something different in the future. The waterfront is the preeminent example of that. Currently in an auto-oriented, sort of underutilized post-industrial area. The future vision for that is a mixed-use neighborhood that has both residential, office, commercial uses, retail, restaurants with public access and open space. There's also the enhanced districts. These are also growth districts, but these are areas where the community is identified as an area that they want to see improved. They like the bones of the area. They like the scale, the development, the dynamic of that space, but there's opportunity for infill development. These are generally commercial nodes that are across the city. The downtown is the preeminent example of that. It is a vibrant, active downtown that has a great mix of residential, office, retail, institutions. Our goal is to sort of just grow that and enhance that dynamic so that it's operating better. And then the third is the conserved districts. It's generally everywhere else. For the most part, the conserved districts are the residential neighborhoods. I won't talk about that too much, just make sure we have time to get into the parking study. So what we identified at Envision Lynn is that there's a need to, as we see the downtown as a regional destination for both work, live, and play, not just the regional for the city of Lynn, but for the North Shore. We want to grow the opportunity in downtown as a place for people to come and do all those things. But one of the needs that we needed to solve there is the parking and making sure that it's accessible for all. So I'm not going to read this whole thing, but this lays out the scope of what the plan is trying to do, what it did in terms of the existing conditions, the future demand management and demand modeling for parking. But on the right here, which I know is impossible to read for all of you, there's 8 goals that were identified in the plan, and generally speaking, they fall under that rubric that I just mentioned that was identified in Vision Lynn, in that we need to identify existing parking supply that can best support diverse and vibrant community in the downtown. So that lines up very well with what Vision Lynn was trying to achieve. Ensure the parking system has options for different user types. So options for residents, options for employees working in office spaces and institutions. So making sure that we're providing a balance of parking that serves both of those needs or all of those needs. Making sure that the parking system is easily accessible. And so that certainly means that there's parking supply available for people to use, absolutely, but also means that the regulations are understandable. That if you're going to try to pay for that parking space, it's easy to pay. It's understandable what you're supposed to do. So making it accessible for all users. The parking system is part of a broader transportation network. So making sure that parking is aligned with the roadways for walking, biking, and transit and cars. So to understand that parking is a part of the transportation network. Streamlining parking management enforcement. Jessica probably really appreciated this one. There's a need to make sure that the technology, the infrastructure that we use to manage, that Jessica and her team uses to manage the parking system, really is most efficient and helps them enforce the system. Because if it's not being enforced, it's not operating, and it's not making sure that it's accessible to the broader community. So that was an important piece of this, to modernize the approach and the technology. I think that the underlying point here is that parking is not the ends, it's the means, right? Parking is part of the means to make sure that we have an active, vibrant, successful downtown. So what's in the parking plan? There's a lot of analysis. So the existing conditions is a really important part of this. And that, of course, is inventorying the parking spaces, both on-street, off-street, public and private, but also inventorying what is the technology, the equipment that's being used. The meters, are the meters broken? Are they working? Are they operating? The kiosk system, the app that we use for parking payment management, inventorying all those things, signage, making sure signage and regulations are lined up. So that's a big piece of the existing conditions analysis. Community engagement, I mentioned there was a couple public meetings that we held, a couple surveys were put out looking for input on people's experiences and what their desires are for a parking system. And all that was brought together, and also stakeholder meetings as well, but both residences, businesses, and property owners, all that kind of goes into the existing conditions analysis. So you have sort of the inventory, the physical accounting of what's going on now, and the impressions and the desires that the community has. And then as a part of the study, I should just say, quick digression, that we hired Stantec, which is a transportation and civil engineering firm. One of the arms of Stantec is focused on parking in communities. So they did this work on behalf of the city. But one of the things that they did was model demand. They modeled demand based on current use, current utilization, looking also at the Institute of Transportation Engineers parking demand models that are developed to calibrate a demand model based on existing experiences, the existing land use across the downtown, and then develop future demand based on projected growth. So what we know in terms of new residential development that's happening downtown, what we know is going to happen for a new commercial development that's associated with that, modeling future demand based on that. So that's really helpful for us to sort of think through what we're going to need in the future for parking supply. And then lastly, kind of folding that all together and creating a comprehensive strategy for parking management to make sure, again, we're meeting those objectives that were articulated early in the plan. So that's what's in the plan. the district is sort of two areas. The dashed line is the overall study area. The data was collected in that entire area, but we established a focus area because we felt that for us to put something together comprehensive across the project, the parking management strategies, and the different land use and development and economic development objectives of the city, that it would be more efficient and more effective if we also focused on the strategies for this core area. So I just want to caveat what I'm about to share is that this is a relatively small slice of the plan. There's a complete existing conditions report that really gets into the weeds that's available online, and I can share that at the end of the presentation. It's about 120 slides of information. So I'm picking out some of the key elements and some of the things that I think most people sort of have asked us about. So this is the inventory. There's over 7,500 parking spaces in the study area. That includes both public and private parking spaces on street and off street. We also inventoried what are the different parking regulations for each space. Is it paid? Is it time restricted? Is there limitations for residents? Is there availability for the broader community during certain times? As a part of that inventory, again, as I mentioned earlier, we also looked at where are their meters? What is the status of the meters? Where are the kiosks? What are the status of kiosks? How is the signage communicating what the current regulations look like? So that's all built into that inventory. And again, I mentioned we looked at both public and private parking spaces. There is, of that 7,500 plus parking spaces, there's about 3,300 public parking spaces. Most of that is on street, over 2,000. There is some off-street parking, as you all, I think, know very well. Things like Buffum parking lot, School Street, and the MBT parking garage. I will note in the inventory, we only counted the number of parking spaces that are currently available in the MBTA garage. So it's only accounting for about 330 spaces for downtown. Whereas, as I think most of you know, the MBTA parking garage was originally built with 900 spaces, 900 plus spaces. There's a lot of information here, but I just want to note again, some of the things we looked at were the physical inventory, but what are the payment options? What are the amenities, parking amenities, particularly for off street? So, how's the pavement? How is the landscaping, lighting? How is signage communicating access for off street? So looking at amenities to make sure that not only is there supply available, that it's accessible and inviting and making it safe. The other piece to this is, again, I mentioned an objective of this is thinking of parking as part of the larger transportation system. How is it to get from the parking spaces to the destination? Is the street network safe and walkable if you park your car to walk to the office? Is there lighting on the street? What's the general conditions of the streetscape as you get from one point to the next? So all that's part of this analysis, but not focusing on that today. So moving into parking utilization. So an overarching sort of objective generally with parking management is to try to achieve an 85% utilization rate. And so the graphic on the right here gives you a feel for what that means. So the ideal 85% utilization rate essentially means on average, in a general case, that every block on street will have a parking space that's available at all times. So that if you're a user looking for a parking space and you're driving through downtown, you're going to find a parking space within that block of that destination that you're trying to go to. So that's the ideal 85% utilization. As soon as you,
is that 85% of the time you're gonna find the spot?
100% of the time there'll be a spot on a block. Yeah, so you're seeking 85% utilization. Yeah, and you're looking for that for off-street parking as well, because that means you don't have to sort of hunt for a parking space if someone is utilizing that space. But if you start getting down below 79%, that's too low. That means that our parking regulations aren't sort of managing the distribution of that use very well. And there's something that we need to address in that case. If you get above 85, pushing into 90 and 100%, that means that we're not managing that well. You have too high of use. We need to balance that a little bit better. So part of the data collection included counts at different time points a day during the week and the weekend. So there's a midday count at noon and at 6 p.m. And then again, it was at 10 p.m. at night on the weekday. And then on a weekend, on a Saturday, there was a count at noon and 6 p.m. to collect that data to see how utilization changed over time. And it changes significantly, not as a big surprise, I think, anybody. So this is what you're seeing up here is a graphic of the weekday midday, which was the highest utilization across the entire study area. Across the entire study area, there's 58% utilization. So we can see at the peak period that there is opportunity to better utilize our existing supply. There's obviously areas in the downtown where you have utilization that is too high. So you can see particularly around Sutton Street by the Andrew Street parking lot right here, on-street parking is too high. And we're seeing that there's a concentration of parking there, but not far away within a block, you have relatively low demand, relatively low utilization. So what we're seeing here is that there's an opportunity to use demand management to better and more efficiently provide access for parking.
Is that because of the courthouse and the juvenile court?
That's part of it, but there's parking around the course of the juvenile court. In fact, the parking lot that serves it actually has very low demand. That's this parking lot right here. It's blue. So it certainly has an impact, but I think it has more to do with the regulation. So what we found in those areas where there's high demand, those are time restricted on-street spaces. They're free time restricted. And the areas adjacent to it, like one block over, are paid parking. So people are using the time restricted instead of paid parking. And so it's it's distorting how people are utilizing the parking. But there is during the day higher utilization in some of the city parking lots. So Buffum, or starting from right to left, School Street, Buffum, Andrews, and then the City Hall lot. Pretty high utilization, but you can still see, particularly in Buffum and Andrews, there is capacity for additional parking there. So thinking about how can we sort of manage that a little bit better. The graphic on the right here, the two bar charts, the midday is the one that has the 58% utilization. On the second bar chart is the evening count, so you can see it goes down a little bit, and then weekend counts were quite a bit lower than the weekday, which may not be a big surprise. So I mentioned modeling, and so this graphic on the right, which is really busy, I know, kind of shows you how the parking utilization for different land uses in a downtown operate. So if you were to stack these across that chart on top of each other and not sort of account for when people are utilizing parking spaces for that particular use, you would see a parking supply need of around 7,500 parking spaces. That would, 7,500 parking spaces. But the way parking happens is it's really based on the use. So resident parking, not surprisingly, generally are going to be using parking spaces during the evening and nighttime and overnight. Restaurants are going to be busier midday, most likely early evening into the evening. Offices from 8 to 5. So you have this ebb and flow of parking need based on land use. So what this graphic is showing you on the right is that the line graph is parking utilization based on the Institute of Transportation Engineers analysis. And then these bars right here, as you move across right here, these are the actual counts that we took in the downtown. So you can see how the ITEE estimates for demand are lining up pretty well with what we're actually accounting for downtown. In fact, the counts downtown during the daytime are a little bit lower than what you would typically model based on the surveys that have been conducted across the country. What we do see overnight, though, is that we counted more parking than you might typically expect if you were basing on the ITE numbers. And that has a lot to do with the number of residential units that are coming in downtown. but we still have a lot of capacity for parking supply. So at the moment, we have enough parking. We just need to manage it better. That's the story there. The next step of this was that Stantec took this data and modeled demand based on future growth. So we know we have nearly 1,000 units in the pipeline for the downtown for residential. We know as a part of that development, there will be a commercial component of that. So they modeled scenarios into the future. And it's not on the screen, it is in existing conditions, but they did find overall downtown that there will still continue to be capacity with that new development. And then what we really wanted to do is test that a little bit in more granular way. They looked at least 2 sub-districts. One of them was really focused around the MBTA garage, around Monroe, Oxford, Market Street. That is an area that once we see that development take place, that there will be a stronger demand and impact on our supply, suggesting not so much that we need to create more supply, we need to preserve the MBTA garage. So that's really feeding into, or part of the MBTA garage is feeding into our policy and work with the MBTA to make sure that any redevelopment of that property either preserves parking spaces or creates new parking spaces in connection with that development. So the bottom line there is that at the moment we have capacity for parking, just to manage it better. Into the future, we see the same dynamic, except where we want to be mindful about the area right around the MBTA garage. Any questions on that?
Is the plan with the garage still the same? Take it down?
Not our plan, no. And we've been having conversations. Yeah, no, I figured that. Yeah. We have had a lot of great conversations with the T and the GM, and they understand our desire to preserve the garage. Over the last year or so, Mass Development has been doing some diligence on the property, on the garage, to see whether or not they have the ability to sort of intervene and be an important player in redeveloping the site. One of the things that they found is that the garage itself actually is pretty structurally sound. The challenge is the circulation. So the staircases are completely generated. The elevators don't work. But overall, the parking garage is structurally sound. So our conversation with the T is looking at what alternatives can be pursued that will support redevelopment, because we don't need 1,000 parking spaces there, and address their need while preserving at least one of the, because it's essentially 2 garages connected by a steel structure, preserving at least one of them. And they're supportive in pursuing that. And how long that takes and what the process seems to be, the work item on our part to how do they
a better alternative than just leveling?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I don't think that works for anybody, really.
What, no, who's going to be responsible for it?
For the garage?
Yeah.
That's what we have to figure out. Yeah, I mean, I think
because that's the issue with the garage. I mean, there's plenty of parking there, but when my office was right next to it, my people wouldn't park there, and I didn't blame them at all. You went over there, and the place was unsupervised. It was, smell of urine. It was. I wouldn't let any of my employees work.
Yeah, the MBTA has made it pretty clear that they don't know how to manage parking garages, and they're trying to get out of the business. So I think long term, I don't think it benefits us if the T continues to be the management entity, frankly. Whether it's private sector or public sector is a bigger question. There is, I think it's at least $19 million in the capital plan, in the MBTA's capital plan. It was originally put into the plan to raise all of it, but they have expressed a willingness to explore repurposing that money to actually restore some of it, if not all of it. And once it gets restored, it's a different ball game in terms of managing it. It's essentially technology upgrades and making sure that there's an entity in there that is interested in managing parking. Because you're right. I mean, one thing we did hear from them a lot was the utilization is super low. Like any given day, there's really no more than 150 cars in there, so it's like 15% utilization, and they spend millions of dollars every year to maintain it and operate the garage. So it's a big money sink for them. They will consistently tell us, hey, there's no demand there, so we don't need it. part of the
Right.
problem. Part of the
The
problem
lighting
is it's not safe. It doesn't feel safe. It doesn't feel welcoming, and it really doesn't actually read as open to the public right now. So there's that's, and I think they're understanding that more now as we continue to have this conversation. Yeah, I think it's obvious to most. It is.
Oh, it is.
Yeah.
There you go.
It is open right now. Yeah, there's about 330 parking spaces that are available.
Is it paid parking?
Yeah, it is paid parking.
Is it kiosk?
Yeah.
That works?
Yeah. I don't know if it works. Yeah, but it's paid parking.
Because
Yeah,
I think the last time I tried it, it didn't work.
yeah,
Yeah, lighting.
yeah.
So was the fear of tearing it down, has that like put off any potential development down there? You know, I remember a while back, I talked to one guy who was gonna do a development down there. So we counted on kind of having the garage
Yeah.
there, and without it, then we would have to add a couple of levels of parking
Yeah.
ourselves, and
Yeah.
it just wasn't feasible.
Yeah, I think the condition, truthfully, the condition of the garage does impact development around it. And you're talking about development not on the garage, you're talking about development in the surrounding area. Absolutely, I think it does change the market perspective. You know, it's one thing to, as you all probably know, in our central business district, we don't have parking requirements for new development. That is a major incentive to attract new development in the downtown. But there's also a market perspective here. You know, a lot of that investment and the development that happened downtown was sort of contingent on the idea that the MBTA garage was there as backup at the very least. Forget about the condition of it. If as an investor or developer, you saw this as an opportunity.
Right.
So I think, I do think that's a part of the equation. How important it is to the sort of the decision making. I think there's a lot of different variables right now that are impacting that at the moment. I think cost of construction is probably a bigger problem than sort of the access to the parking garage, but it absolutely is a consideration. Yeah, I think what we were seeing for development in the downtown was roughly the developers would provide one parking space for 3 units on their own. That's not a regulatory requirement. That's from their perspective, that's what the market needed for them to be able to lease up their spaces. So maybe that number pushes up a little bit, and that changes the equation for development. So that's a piece of it. And then, you know, part of our, you know, our perspective from an economic development vantage point is, you know, whether or not there's demand right now in the garage, in the MBTA garage, there's a need to have that capacity to sort of help attract that development. We want people to park there rather than developers to build buildings that have parking. Because if they're building buildings that have parking, you're going to have ground floors that are parking garages, and that's not a great way to activate your downtown. You need streets that are walkable, that have active ground floor uses instead of parking. They can find ways in many cases to sort of tuck it up behind, but that's not always the case. So, you know, I think to your point, there's an objective in preserving all or some of the garage to help continue to support economic development in downtown. Absolutely.
Is that meaning that the train stop won't come back to its location until the garage is set to go?
No, that they're separate. So my perspective on how the T's viewing their infrastructure, we'll call it their infrastructure, is they're separate projects, and that's sort of good and bad. There's good and bad pieces to that. So the garage and the commuter rail station repair are 2 separate projects. They're managed by 2 separate entities within MBTA. They're both capital delivery, but they're different people, different engineers, different processes. So, you know, they're not waiting on the garage. They're just waiting on their capacity and ability to move that forward. So those things will happen.
I don't know if that makes the garage go faster.
Yeah, I think, yeah. I mean, there's a lot of interest. I know the mayor's office, the delegation have been pushing very hard on the MBTA and the GM. I think the GM understands the need, and sort of the key question is what's the right entity at the state level to develop the property. So I'll just jump into the recommendations briefly. So there's 4 strategy areas that Stantec developed and then within these strategy areas, there are a number of recommendations. So the first one is addressing the fact that many users' needs are not met by the city's current parking regulations. So we talked a little bit about this in the utilization. There are some certain pockets right in the downtown that had high utilization, and one block over, there would be very low utilization. So that's an example of how the system right now is not fully providing for users' needs. Another example is, for instance, Buffum Street, right over here. The Buffum Street parking lot is only, for a while, it has recently changed because of actions Jessica's taken, but for a while was only accessible by a permit. So if you were coming downtown or you're a resident, you couldn't park there, even though it's half empty most of the time, if not more overnight. So that's another example of how the parking system is not aligning with the parking needs for downtown. So that's what that first strategy area is talking about. The second one is using demand management. So they're kind of combined. Strategies 1 and 2 are combined action areas. So making sure we're aligning the parking system to the user's needs and demand managing it more effectively through pricing. And then the third strategy area is looking more at infrastructure more generally in the downtown and including in the parking. So street maintenance conditions and practices that limit parking system success. So we heard a lot from residents downtown that street sweeping overnight is problematic because we essentially every night during the week restrict parking on street. So we have to balance the need to reduce litter and trash in our downtown. That's a priority. So we're not going to change that right now, but it's an example of how the street network are a part of the broader picture. Other areas are like, are the sidewalks, is it safe to walk and bike or take transit downtown? Again, thinking of parking as part of a transportation network. So making investments and not traditionally infrastructure that's traditionally considered parking, making the streets safer and more walkable. And then maintenance needs and capital improvements on just equipment. So kiosks that operate, meters that operate, so that we can ensure that the demand management tools that we're putting into place actually help sort of sift through the utilization. And then the last one is making sure that there's ample capacity for future growth. And there's a couple of approaches. One of, we talked a lot about the MBTA garage, and we're intent on making sure that capacity, or at least a portion of it, is available. But how can we really leverage a lot of the private parking lots that are underutilized to be part of the larger system, the public system? So there are lots that, I'll just jump back here briefly. There are lots within the downtown that are private that can be better used for public service. So the Brickyard property where Shop and Compare is, since Shop and Compare opened up, the use there has been a little bit more, but that there's a fair amount of supply on that could be utilized for public benefit. So looking at public-private partnerships where the city could partner with a private property owner to make some subset of parking spaces available to the broader community. So that's another way of addressing the supply challenge. So I'm not going to read all of these, but essentially under each of those strategy areas are a series of recommendations based into a near-term, mid-term, and long-term implementation. Orange is generally near-term. So these are priority actions that we really want to jump on. So one thing we found is that the time limitation is not a very useful tool to manage parking for two reasons. From an economic development perspective, when you have a two-hour limit, you're telling visitors to your downtown, you got 2 hours and then you got to go. That is not the message we want to be sending to people coming to our town. We want to say, you're welcome to come to downtown. We want to make parking available for you, and you can stay as long as you want. It might just cost you a little bit. So we want to remove the parking limitation. The second piece of that is that as we saw in that utilization, it actually doesn't manage parking so that you have that 85% utilization across the system. All right. Pricing is much better at managing demand than time limitations. It's also more responsive because that utilization is going to shift as new land uses come in, as new development come in, or as behaviors change. So pricing is more flexible and responsive to how people utilize parking in a downtown, or really anywhere, frankly. So extending or removing the on-street parking limits, provide for short-term parking. So one thing we've heard, and you will frequently hear in mixed-use downtowns or any commercial district, is we need to preserve the ability for quick convenience parking. So someone can pop into a coffee shop and pick up a coffee. They're in and out in 10 minutes. So instead of providing 15-minute parking limits, which again tell somebody you've got 15 minutes to get in and get out, allow free parking for 15 minutes or 20 minutes everywhere. Because it's fine if someone's parking and you have 85% utilization in that area. Just get in. If you want the coffee and you want to go, we'll just make it free. We'll facilitate that. And that actually supports the businesses across the downtown rather than the few that are actually able to get that limitation in front of their business. Oops, I think this is just hard to read. Just so you know, items 1 through 4 are near term. I'm noticing that the colors here are a little hard to read. So items 1 through 4 are near term, 5 through 7 are midterm. And then update the list of parking. So right now, we have short-term parking with the time limitation and some fee. What we're finding through enforcement is it's pretty punitive. There's a lot of parking violations that are being put out right now. And so what we want to do is shift to a pricing model that if you were to accidentally go over your time for whatever reason, you're not getting hit with a really big ticket, a big fee. It's just a reminder that, hey, it's better to pay that extra 50 cents for the hour than get hit with a $15 or $25. We don't want to make it a punitive thing. It's really it's managing that system. And then the sort of second piece to this is implementing a pricing strategy, and that's based on performance. So those areas where you saw high utilization could be a little bit more because there's high demand there. So maybe it's 75 cents an hour rather than 50 cents. And then the areas where it's low demand, sometimes 1 block over, 2 blocks over, it's less, maybe 50 cents. So you're basically managing that demand based on pricing. And then looking at off-street parking, where it's a little bit further away, long-term parking, make that even a little bit less. So it's using pricing to demand manage a little bit better so that you can get a more consistent utilization rate across the system. And then a very important part of this, and Jessica has done an amazing job, probably talked about this, I think last month, enforcing the regulations are key to make sure that demand management is happening, but also regularly measuring utilization because it's going to constantly change. Again, based on land use change, new development, changes in behavior, transit system moving a half mile away from its existing location. So, at a minimum, we want to measure utilization every 6 months and use that data to update the pricing strategy so that we're managing the system well. Those two things really need to happen together for it to be effective. And then strategy area 3, it's a little sort of disorganized here, but number 3, aggressively address the litter problem. I know it's weird to bring this up in a parking strategy, but you can see how our street sweeping policy does impact parking. It also impacts economic vitality of our downtown. So felt it was important to really note that the litter is a part of the parking infrastructure.
Take Central Square. They Tuesdays and Thursdays you can't park on one side of the street. Mondays and Wednesdays the other, something like that. But for instance, last weekend they came in on Thursday, so the left side of the square was wide open, but it obviously hadn't been swept. How frequently are they actually sweeping the streets that we're going to a 2-day a week, or 4-day a week if you take both sides?
Yeah. Yep. My understanding, they are sweeping every night. There is occasion where, even though there has been, frankly, aggressive enforcement for overnight parking, where cars sometimes are parking there, and the street sweeper is not able to get to where they need to. So there are things that might happen, but my understanding is they are out there almost every
Every
night.
night.
Yeah, yeah. And to be to be frank, I mean, that is a much higher frequency than the standard.
Well, that's why, that, from what I see, and granted, I'm not there overnight, but it seems like it's, once every couple of weeks that they're coming down one side of the street. So that's why I was wondering whether we're on the
Yeah.
4-day-a-week stretch.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the recommendation is to not change that until there's improvement on sort of the reduction of litter in the downtown. So street sweeping is sort of the last the last line of defense. The litter's gone from the sidewalk to the sidewalk into the gutter for whatever, makes its way into the gutter. There's methods that we should be looking at to prevent the trash from making it onto the sidewalk. Work with businesses, owners downtown to sort of work with our DPW and help clean up so that it's not getting into the street. Once we get to that stage, we can reduce the number or the frequency of on-street sweeping. But first, we really got to come up with a litter program before we do that, because what we did here in the survey and the engagement was like, yes, I'm concerned about the frequency of street sweeping, but I'm more concerned about the amount of
Oh, yeah, no,
litter.
the trash is a huge issue.
but-
And that falls on the DPW.
Yeah, they
Yeah.
have they have a person who's out there essentially every night, except
Yeah,
on weekends.
Well, I mean, it's a thing, if I came every day and said, oh, boy, the square looks great, then I say, okay, they were out sweeping. But
Yeah.
You come in every day to,
Too much.
yeah, I mean, granted, everything funnels right down to the square.
Yeah.
From from Union Street and Mount Vernon and whatnot, but you're not seeing the results that you would expect, is
Yeah,
guess what I'm
yeah.
saying.
I
To
think,
warrant the parking.
yeah, understandable. Yeah, I hear you. I mean, I see it myself. I think it's really an example of just how bad our trash and litter problem is.
So you're aggressively looking at addressing it, so what's the next step in that? Number 3.
First, I got to finish this plan and implement that. I mean, I think we haven't, I haven't been part of a broader study on that, but I'll tell you, my thinking is that there needs to be more, again, infrastructure, litter infrastructure. So the city, we've been pretty aggressive in putting out more barrels, working with this organization that installed barrels for free. They maintain them. I still think there's a need for additional barrels so that, people can, if they're, if they got to grab and go, they don't have to carry it halfway across downtown to throw it out. It's very convenient. I think they're still continuing work on awareness campaign. I know the mayor's office really pumped ARPA funding into the summer program so that the youth could be out there picking up trash. So I think all those need to be looked at. Making that permanent if possible.
Is littering even exist anymore? Is that a finable offense?
I believe it is. Yeah, I believe it is. I honestly don't know the answer to that. I honestly don't know the answer. Is it police?
But I think they've just got
Yeah.
so much on their plate. It's not.
I think that's, yeah. And I think, again, going right to the punitive solution, I think is problematic. I think first you want to provide the facilities in the programming to reduce it. And once you have adequate facilities and the support structure, if someone's still just throwing trash, then you can be a little bit more punitive. But I think first you want the systems in place. Absolutely. Just as we're on this topic, to get us back into parking a little bit, the top item, which is a long-term solution, but there's a concept called the parking benefits district. So the idea is you basically create a parking benefits district in the downtown. Revenues that's generated from the meters and the pricing, even if there is still citations given, revenues generated in that parking program can be used and invested in that district for things that you may not think is parking related, but you could use that funding for trash. You could buy trash barrels. You could hire someone to pick up trash. You can buy new wayfinding signs. You can make roadway improvements so it's more walkable. You could buy lighting, landscaping. So you can use the parking revenues to reinvest in downtown, because that's where the revenues are being generated. And you want to invest so that in thinking about the downtown system as a part of the entire parking system. So that's another way of finding the revenue source to address some of these tangential needs. So I raised that. We had it as a long-term strategy, primarily because the deep need is to do better at creating a parking management, demand management system, eliminating the time restriction or extending those and using pricing to manage space. We're going to implement that first, get that up and running, and then and then iterate as we can implement. And then lastly, on the bottom here, couple things. Get a little bit better at communicating what the parking regulations are, provide a really clear map. What we found in the downtown is that there's a lot of conflicting signage, regulatory signage. In some places you'll see a sign that says you can't park here from 8 to 10, and then you can't park here until from 9 to 7 or something. There was conflicting signage, so cleaning that up, providing wayfinding so people can actually find the off-street parking if they're willing to park there, and knowing that it's available. Like, you don't know the MBTA garage is available. Like, let the broader community, the region, know that that's an available thing. So it's actually not a small issue. Moving into the final strategy. So thinking about parking demand, we talked about the MBTA garage. So there's some other tools that we can deploy, like the transportation demand management. As new development comes in, they can support their new residents or businesses by encouraging or incentivizing transit trips and that sort of thing to actually mitigate the use of need for parking. So if you live downtown, maybe you don't really need to own a car, particularly if you're renting a unit that doesn't have really any on-site parking. So thinking about transportation demand management to reduce the future demand based on new development. Electric vehicles, it's not necessarily directly related to sort of capacity and supply issues, but we do know that EVs are coming, and we need to do a little bit better in providing that resource to the community. And then expand public bicycle parking downtown. Different kind of parking, but parking nonetheless. So these are some of the things to help sort of mitigate future demand from new development. So again, these are the strategy areas. I know I've rifled through them. I will say online in our linnincommon.com webpage, the project page for the downtown parking plan, there's an in-depth analysis and sort of description on each action item, like 4 slides for each. So if you really want to get to the how and why it works and what the intentions are, it's a good place to go. But I just want to wrap up with one final thing. So there's packages. There's essentially packages of implementation strategies that need to go together. I mentioned it a little bit earlier. The parking supply and demand management is the first one we want to tackle. So dealing with the term regulations and introducing pricing. And so right now, what you're seeing here is essentially a heat map where most of the demand of the parking was downtown. And so you can see here a recommendation. So the red area, that's going to be a little bit higher cost to park on street. The green area is a little bit lower because we're seeing lower utilization. And then off-street parking, we also, like school at Buffalo, we want to make that a lower cost to incentivize the use of those parking spaces, particularly for people parking for a long time. So the package of regulations would be to eliminate the long-term parking, create a pricing strategy, buy the equipment to facilitate pricing, like kiosks, and enforcement tools and technology for the parking department to efficiently manage that system. That's the first package of implementation items that we're still working through. So that the plan is essentially done in terms of recommendations, but we're working through what that first step will look like. What's the cost to purchase that? Where to implement it? What's the signage upgrade, et cetera, et cetera. So that's how this all comes together into sort of buckets of implementation.
Okay.
Back here, I'll come back to you.
Just 2 quick things, Aaron, and thank you for the presentation. My first thought is that the current conditions of some of the lots.
Yeah.
Is there a possibility maybe putting new fences up and paving and make it more attractive?
Yeah,
Hopefully,
yeah,
Not only for us as well as for people coming into the auditorium, right, for the show.
absolutely.
My second thought is, when I'm still working, someone, I won't take the credit, but it's a great idea, building a mini garage on current city employees parking lot on Johnson Street, 3 or 4 levels. I think maybe we even talked about when I was there.
Yeah.
Obviously, the employee can still use it, but on days of the concert, you have a garage right there.
Yeah. Yeah, there definitely in the plan it identifies the need to invest in the parking lots themselves to make it more attractive, and feel safe. That's absolutely in there. The sort of the next step is to sort of build that capital plan to do that and find the funding. And again, the one of the values of coming with a pricing structure, it's not about generating revenue, but one of the outcomes is that there is revenue to invest back into the system. The garage question is a challenging one because it costs about $100,000 a parking space to build a garage. That's a couple of years ago. So it's probably more now. So part of the reason we didn't talk a lot about parking garages other than the T is we don't have a high demand right now that would justify spending that kind of money. But what's in the recommendations is, as we sort of implement the demand strategy and are regularly monitoring use, we can see how the demand is changing and plan for those sorts of things when we get to that need. The parking systems rarely pay for a garage. That's the underlying challenge there.
$100,000 per vehicle.
Yeah.
That seems extreme.
Yeah. It's I think the range we've seen is 75 to 100,000, but I would probably lean towards the 100,000 these days. Gold-plated parking spaces. Yeah, it's crazy. 100,000 a space, so
So the MBTA garage is about 500,000.
Yeah.
That's.
I think that's why we're seeing it. That's why we're seeing an opportunity to work with the T to preserve that, because they have money in their capital plan that they could deploy, and may be open to deploying for other
Will the
purposes.
city have the ability to select those kiosks, or because that might be a concern, for especially seniors trying to figure that thing out.
Yeah.
And frustration, they just.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. One of the biggest one of the biggest barriers to on-street parking with the kiosk system is not the price. It's actually figuring out how to pay. So that short-term parking, that free 15 minutes, 20 minutes, a lot of that has to do with the transaction cost. You want to go get your coffee, but you just don't feel like opening up your app because it takes you longer to open the app to get the coffee. So we just, we want to remove that barrier. But generally speaking, one of the next steps will be looking at the technology to make it as seamless as possible. And honestly, and this is the next step. There's decisions around, do the kiosks take cash or coins? That's a big maintenance cost to the parking department. It's a big maintenance cost, and it's a big management time suck. But it also makes it more accessible for people who don't like using phones, don't want to whip out a credit card, may not have access to a credit card. So some of the decision making is going to be thinking about how can we make the system accessible to everybody. It's a great question. Not easy one to answer, actually, to come up with the perfect solution.
Right, so getting back to Central Square, where that's short term, does that mean the plan is finalized and we can go online and see what it is, or?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Wow, great segue. This is the webpage, lynn.com/parking. I'm happy to send that out to Rick, and if you want to forward it to others. There's a number of documents that are on this page. So there's the full existing conditions report, that get deep dive into the data and the demand modeling, et cetera. There's also a full recommendations report that, as I said, for each recommendation, we just zip through, gives a lot of detailed analysis on why this is supposed to work and what's intending to do and how to implement it. That's definitely there. There's also, not there at the moment, but I'm hoping to get it up by the end of this week. There's 4 videos of presentations from Stantec talking through the key elements of the existing conditions analysis to basically sort of boil it down to like the key issues, the key takeaways from the existing use. So you don't have to read the whole thing if you don't want to. You're welcome.
Well, I assume from what you're saying is that the time is going away. It's gonna be basically all kiosk out there.
That's our approach. Yep.
And then for the people running to the coffee shop or stopping at my place for 10 minutes, there's gonna be some way for them to get in
You
and
won't have to
out.
worry about it. Yeah, and you know, to be clear, the next phase of implementation of purchasing the kiosks, adjusting the signage, and then communicating out this change, because there's a big piece of this is going to be promoting and communicating how the parking system would change. It's going to take several months, year. You know, it's going to take a lot of time. And you just think about the lead time to purchase kiosks. It'll take a long time. So as a part of a rollout and implementation, there's going to be a considerable amount of outreach and engagement, so people at least know what's up. Because that's I think a big piece of our problem is that it's kind of unclear what the rules are. You know, we don't want
Well,
that.
you also didn't enforce them for 3 years. So, yeah.
That's also a problem.
Yeah.
But I will say, so we, you know, there's this downtown area, the strategy area here in Dashmar. I think as we look at the capital investment needed to transition to the pricing strategy, there may be sub-districts that are pilot areas that we start with, just partly to sort of test it out, you know, make sure we have the funding there to purchase the equipment. But I think more importantly, making sure that we work out the kinks before we do the whole thing. So that also, you know, working with Jessica in the next phase of this is to figure, okay, as we move to implementation, do we try to do the full Monty, or do we focus on an area that we can sort of pilot it?
Any other questions, Baron? Any sneak peeks into any of the other things you guys are working on down there?
A couple things. Well, the big one is we are working in early stages of what we're calling zoning reform. So coming out of Vision Lynn, again, one of the short-term recommendations was to revamp our zoning code. And I will say a really big chunk of that is boring, because what we're trying to do is essentially rework what we're calling the operating system. The zoning code hasn't been updated comprehensively in a long, long time. So just from an accessibility and usability perspective, it's challenging. So we're trying to revamp the zoning code so that it's accessible, usable, and then plug in some of the changes that we talked about, or some of that address the ideas around transformation, enhancement. So downtown, for instance, I don't see there being major changes in the central business district. One thing we are exploring is, as you know, mixed use multifamily is allowed by right up to 10 stories downtown, as long as there's a ground floor commercial use. It's a great incentive. It's a great way to activate our downtown. But one of the challenges is not every street in our downtown really should have a commercial use on the ground floor. In its own way can be sort of a barrier to redevelopment. So we're looking at, can we concentrate that requirement on certain streets so that, you know, we have our active commercial streets? Because if you have the full 160 acres of your downtown that have that requirement, you're sort of diluting the opportunity of creating an active street front. So that's just an example of one thing that we're looking at. There's likely not to be anything to share until the new year, but we would hope to share something out in January, February of new year to get some feedback on. That's probably one of the bigger things we're working on right now.
Thanks. And we have Donnie Smith from the mayor's office here. Anything you want to add, Donnie?
No, really. No, we've been working on this parking study with the parking planning.
How about traffic study? Is that excellent?
Well, we recently completed a safety action plan. That's probably not addressing the main things that you're thinking about. You're probably thinking about traffic congestion. The safety action plan was prepared coming out of the Vision Zero commitment that the city council made about I think 6 months ago. And essentially what that commitment is to eliminate crashes that result in death or serious injury. And it's a sort of a shakeup in how transportation engineers look at transportation planning and design. Historically, they would say, we're going to try to eliminate crashes to zero, all crashes. They're just not going to happen. We're human beings. We make mistakes, but we can focus our efforts on eliminating crashes that cause death and serious injury. So we just finished a plan, identified the high energy network, so the street corridors and intersections that have the highest rates and instances of those two types of crashes, and got a $9 million Safe Streets for All grant through FHWA. We'll be looking to implement that. So that's going to make it safer in the city to drive and walk and bike and take transit. But it's not necessarily going to address some of the congestion issues. There are projects, complete roadway reconstruction projects on Essex Street and Western Ave that will have congestion mitigation tools in there, upgrading traffic signals and intersections to operate better. Western Ave is at the what we call the 25% design stage. It's programmed for construction, I think for 2028. It's pushing out a little bit, but it's programmed, so it's going to happen. I would expect some community engagement on the concept design, again, early in the new year. The concept is now going through the MassDOT design process. It's a very arduous process, but anyway, that's the kind of project you might be thinking more of that could help sort of mitigate the traffic congestion.
Means to collect some funding with some punitive action. Imagine the tickets.
Oh, enforcement. Yeah. Well, I think we're seeing some of that. There's this camera up on Central Ave, right by City Hall. It's on a stanchion. I don't know if you ever noticed it. It's right at the intersection there at City Hall Square. That was installed as a pilot, but to do just that because so many people were parking too close to the intersection and essentially preventing fire trucks from being able to make that turn. So it's a safety concern. So that actually takes pictures of people who park there, and then they get a ticket in the mail. Yeah. Again, honestly, not a revenue generator. It's really about safety. And you're right to mention where people park as a safety concern, because what we do see across the city is when people park too close to an intersection, it reduces sight lines and causes people to pull out or try to make the turn onto the street when they can't see oncoming traffic.
Is there a distance that's
Yeah, it's based on speeds and sort of the site conditions. It's not a single number, but yeah, it's basically a sight triangle. You take the position of the car at the intersection, the sight lines and speed, and then you draw a triangle, a visual triangle, as if you're the operator, and you need a minimal amount of sight line to be able to make that turn
That's
safely.
why in a lot of new development, we'll probably see it on Western Ave where it kind of jetties out near the intersection, so people can't park up that way, and it leaves a wider place for pedestrians to cross the street.
Right. That's a great tool to mitigate that concern. But that's a big issue, I think, in the city right now.
All right, Aaron, thank you so much.
All right, thank you, everybody. Really appreciate it.
And then Ryan's got a couple of things to touch on. Ryan Newhall, interim executive director, also joined by 15 past chair. Thank you, Aaron.
Thank you, Rick.
I'm sure we'll
Appreciate
see you again soon.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for informative. We always love having you here. Thank you with the Great Lynn Chamber of Commerce. Rick, thank you for all you do with the government affairs, always bringing us informative conversations. We do have a couple of announcements. We have a new member, the Institution for Savings. They're having a credit for Light Fair. They're having two of them actually, one for Lynn Tech and Lynn Classical, and another one for Lynn English. Looking for volunteers to come out. I have more information about that, but anybody in the business community that can volunteer to work with our high school students, that'd be great. I have some handouts here. It's just a
junior achievement type thing? Or?
It's so what it is the kids all go around with their cell phones and get a budget, and they go to different things about whether they want to rent an apartment and find a roommate, buy auto insurance, get a car that's a flashier car, how they spend their money. So it's a budgeting thing. So there's some handouts here. Those are coming up. Lynn Classical and Lynn Tech are on November 14th, and then Lynn English is on November 18th. So there's some information here about that. Just a couple other things real quick, get my notes back here. We have Fall Fest Tuesday, the 22nd, that's at Brotherhood Credit Union from 5:30 to 7:30 and after hours. And then on Thursday, we have our breakfast club at Flowers by Lorraine and K Security. They just, people back there, Jim and Patrick, they just did their spaces over, K Security and Flowers by Lorraine. So we're gonna have a coffee there in the morning. If anyone wants to stop by, we'll be there from 8:30 to 9:30. And then on Thursday, November 7th, we're gonna have a breakfast club and a ribbon cutting at Optech Services on Essex Street. So the mayor's office will be there for a ribbon cutting, and we'll have some coffee and hope to see you all there. Again, thank you, Rick. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you all for joining us. That's all I
Just
got.
one more thing, the office pushed it out last week, but Marissa Angeli from the school department reached out to me. They're looking for business owners to go in and speak to the kids in the schools about entrepreneurship and, you know, kind of tell your story and, you know, where you come from, where you've been, and kind of serve as a role model for a lot of the kids in the schools. I've done it at Tech. It's pretty cool to go and engage with the kids. So you can find that on the website. Check prior emails, but the post is there. Reach out to Marissa, and I should love to have our members contact.
And you can reach out to the office too if you have any more information. Most of you have my cell phone number. If you need more, if any questions about that, we can definitely get you the information.
All right, thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
That was very informative.
Oh, good, good. It's hard to key in on here too. A lot of stuff in there.
Oh, there's a lot.
Thanks, Aaron.
Thanks very much.
Good job.
Thank you.